This is the Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Board-Deronay. This week, our guest is Sara Bronin.
Sara is an architect, an attorney, and a professor, as well as a policymaker. She also founded and directs the National Zoning Atlas.
And she recently released a book titled Key to the City, How Zoning Shapes Our World. And with Sara, we talk about zoning. All things zoning, her personal backstory, how she transitioned from architect to policymaker, attorney, and zoning expert, right?
Yes, and we talked about how she started the Zoning Atlas and kind of like the mission and all the groundwork that's been put into that. What she's seen with zoning and kind of like the issue of how the text has been written or how it's been updated, not updated, kind of those types of issues.
Yes, because one of the common challenges with zoning regulations is that they're convoluted and confusing and contradictory, and we dive into that with Sara. Sponsors.
One of the best tools we found for specification and project management is Programma, an outstanding all-in-one suite designed specifically for interior designers. With Programma, you can create schedules, mood boards, and invoices and share all your project information with contractors and clients through the convenient client dashboard. Projects can get complicated, but Programma simplifies everything, saving you time so you can focus on design. Start thriving with Programma by tapping the link in our episode notes and use the code SECONDSTUDIO to save 25% on your annual subscription. Would you like to get Asbirds faster?
Yes.
Okay. IPX has you covered. IPX lets you seamlessly transform laser scans into LOD 300 BIM and CAD files. Whether you've got your 3D scans already or need the full laser scanning service, IPX offers instant pricing and order tracking for scan-to-BIM services on any project, no matter the size or complexity. Once a building scan is complete, IPX delivers detailed BIM, CAD, 360 virtual tours, and material takeoffs in their platform, where you can view, share, export, query, and quantify areas, floors, and materials. Check out the IPX link in our show notes.
Revit users, you have access to a powerful new capability you might not know about. Available with Revit version 2023.1 onward, Autodesk Insight is a next-generation carbon analysis tool that can help you make the leap toward low-carbon design. With only a few clicks, Insight lets you analyze, understand, and track the embodied and operational carbon impact of your design choices. You can then visualize opportunities for energy efficiency and carbon mitigation with its flexible dashboards, helping you make more sustainable and informed decisions. Check out the Insight link in our show notes to learn more. This is the Second Studio with myself, Marina, and our guest, Sara Bronin. Here we go.
So I grew up in Houston, the only large American city without zoning. And my childhood home was an apartment complex. And it had, we lived on the second story. And it was, every unit was accessed through an exterior walk. So it was doors. It wasn't a building. It was more of a patio apartment complex. And there was sort of arranged around courtyards, and there was a pool, and it was, at least from my memory, a nice little place with some older families and some younger kids too. And my grandparents also lived in another little courtyard within the same apartment complex, so that was nice.
Oh, that's cool. So you guys were all really close to each other.
Yes, forever.
Forever. I like that. And so how did you end up deciding to study architecture? Did you have a parent who was an architect, someone else who was an architect? Did you know what it was when you were a kid?
No, my dad was a civil engineer, and he definitely took me to construction sites. He was responsible for building out a lot of the fiber optic cable in and around the city of Houston. And my mom's a school teacher, and they're both retired and still living in Houston. As I write about in the book, or in the within the city limits of Houston, not technically Houston. But I think just kind of being around him and seeing the way that, his drawings, I couldn't exactly go down into the manholes, but you could kind of get a sense of, when we would visit a site, there's what's going on, or there's a trench and there's what we're doing. And, getting a sense of how drawings turned into real built stuff was kind of a cool thing. And I don't know what triggered exactly my interest in architecture, but I knew that growing up in Houston, I was surrounded by a lot of not very beautiful, not very great architecture. So uh, there are some really great buildings. One of my favorite buildings, the Mill Museum, is there, but a lot of it is sort of strip malls and desolate situations.
Yeah, kind of.
I
Okay,
feel
I
like there is a
understand.
lot of those all around the US.
Yeah, that's fair. There's a lot of that. So I'm guessing that did you go straight to the University of Texas right after high school? Was that the track for you to study architecture?
Yeah, yes. 5-year
Gotcha.
Bachelor of Architecture.
Okay, cool. And something we always like to ask also as well is when you first started architecture school, was there anything that surprised you? Was it different than what you expected?
I didn't really have any expectations about how things would go. um,
Yeah.
I, I mean, definitely architecture students are a sort of select breed in that they've chosen a life that is very different from the rest of their undergraduate peers. They're always in studio and working. But one of the things I loved about the architectural education is that you learn so many different disciplines. So you're doing
Mm.
physics, you're doing drawing, you're doing sort of 3D building, modeling, envisioning, you're doing architectural history and theory. You are traveling because architecture schools always have some sort of travel component for students. And you're really working in a sort of hive of activity with your peers, and there's no other place like it. And a lot of what I did in architecture school and the ways I learn and think now really developed back then.
That's really fascinating because during architecture school, you ended up becoming interested in other things that were not strictly architecture as well, right?
Certainly, yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, but really, my whole career is about how we can improve the built environment.
Right, right, right. So, a more, I guess you could call it traditional path of an architecture student is you do your 5 years and then maybe let's say people go to get a master's in architecture or they go to practice at an architecture firm. They get licensed and they design and draw buildings for a living. But you end up getting a master's in economic and social history, which is a bit different. So I'm curious, like what led you down this tangential path? What caused you to kind of look in this different but overlapped direction?
Well, I got a Rhodes Scholarship, and they don't have an architecture school at Oxford. So I sort of decided to do a thesis and to study actually historic preservation, which is very related to, of course, what I do now. So that was, I guess, step one after architecture school. But I will say that I do have an architecture license. So I did work for an architect. I did take all the exams and I did get my
Yeah.
license.
Yeah.
That was very important to me, actually. There's not that many Hispanic female architects. So it was important for me to go through that process, even though it was not necessary given my later choices.
And it's so impressive because you do that, and again, it's so much work, as you know, to study architecture, do the exams, practice, all that stuff. But then you also have a degree in law. So, like, I don't know how many people in recent history have are a licensed architect and have a degree in law and are an attorney. There cannot be that many people that exist out there. There must be a
I
very
know
small club.
I know one who's also a law professor, actually, and
Yeah.
I know another one, but I don't know if he ever got an architecture license, but he did have an architecture degree, and then went to law school. So there's possibly two that I have met, and not that many. And I do keep them both up, so I do keep both of my licenses up, and that's um, it's I'm a member of the AIA, so there's AIA licensing requirements, and then there's the various bar continuing legal education requirements, and it's fine. I'm my real um, job, or my main career path is being a professor, so I should be in favor of more learning. But it
Hmm.
is, as you probably know, a hassle to keep up those credits
That's
across
true.
all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Once a year or whatever it is, you have to take those those courses and pay some fees. Um,
Hmm.
I guess the bigger question would be like, what motivated you to study law? Again, as opposed to just practicing as a traditional architect as your full career and just do that.
Well, I think you learn in architecture school that there is a lot of things that you don't know. I mean, for most people in architecture school, they go because they're curious about a lot of different things. As I mentioned, it's a very interdisciplinary degree. But I found out in really maybe the last year of school that, oh, hey, there are all these other things like building codes and zoning rules and property laws that affect how and what an architect can build. And before I go out and figure out what I want to do, I really need to understand how to read those rules and how to interpret them so that maybe I can use that information in the future. And that's what I did. And that's why I went to law school.
And so during that time, was zoning specifically something that you knew you had an interest in, or that also you knew was a place that was problematic but had a lot of potential to have a good impact? Or did that kind of interest come later on?
I mean, I think it's something that came later on in that, again, it was one of those sets of rules that were particularly, that piqued my interest in law school. But I guess really thinking about, oh, am I going to have a career thinking and writing about zoning? No, I did not come until after I had, gone through law school and taken land use classes and urban legal history and, of course, property law, which is a core course for law students, and real estate transactions law and water law and all of these things that really work together to give a broad perspective of how we organize our property and our property rights in this country.
Mm-hmm. So you finished law school in 2006, I think. Is that right? What happens after that?
Oh, I became a professor and started teaching property and land use law. And I also started doing a lot of consulting work. So among my big projects was a project, actually, how I got my architecture hours. I worked for a developer who was both an architect and an MBA, and I was both the attorney, but I also helped to manage the project. And it was a $180 million project, building from scratch on a vacant lot in downtown New Haven, which had been vacant for decades, maybe 40 years, and took the project through zoning approvals, through a city land disposition agreement, through the financing documents, all the way through tenant leasing, and just really, helped with that project start to finish. And it was the first LEED ND Platinum building in the country. And I still, to this very day, work with that developer on different little projects, not as a paid helper, but just we have some things that we have in common in terms of, just ideas about sustainability and so on. So I'm always glad to see him in this phase of life. But that really, the combination of being a professor and then doing something else has been something that really has characterized my whole career. I've always been a professor, no matter what. And then I've always had other stuff going on. And after that, moving from New Haven to Hartford, and starting as a law professor, but then also getting involved in local government. First at the Historic Properties Commission, and then later for the Planning and Zoning Commission was I guess, the next plus one things that I was doing in my job.
I mean, it's impressive because I taught part-time off and on for a period at architecture studios, and teaching takes obviously more effort, or not obviously, it takes more effort than people typically think. So I'm always impressed when folks manage to be a professor and teach, but then also do other things outside of that successfully. It's not an easy balance, I find.
Yeah, the teaching part is, to me, maybe the most straightforward, because at this point, hopefully I know as much or a little more than the students. And so you kind of get a sense of confidence from that. But the thing that's really what characterizes, full-time tenured professor is writing. And that's something that I just do because I have to. I personally have to write down the things that I'm thinking about. And you see that in the book, you see that in the articles that I write, and, different things that I do, in different volunteer positions or sort of external positions. And that's what I like to write and sort of express, okay, what, whatever I'm thinking about at the time, I almost feel like if I don't write it down, then did it happen? Was it my idea at all? And so you just have to, so I do write and write and write. And that's, I think, a big part of being a professor is the, having an interest in research and writing it down.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's a good fit then. It's a good fit then. And so
Turns out.
It turns out. So, and then more recently, relatively recently, you came out with a book, which is Key to the City, How Zoning Shapes Our World.
Yes, I have it right here if you ask me any tough questions about it.
There we go. There it is. Our copy's on the shelf behind Marina. And you've written a few books prior to that. But just maybe as an easy way into this part of the conversation for folks who are not experts in zoning, which would be us as well, talk to us about the book and I'm also wondering what caused the initial motivation to write it?
I mean, again, just the impulse to try to reach new people with some of the things that I've learned about in my travels or that I wanted to communicate about this very important but often overlooked area of law that governs so much of what happens in the United States. So I think really that the impetus for writing it was that people need to know. People need to know about zoning. People need to understand what it is and what it does. And I do think, for me anyway, the book is my attempt to use storytelling in a way I haven't before, and to identify areas of the country that are doing interesting things, so that people can maybe catch a glimpse of some town they know or some place nearby, and understand what they're doing right, and in some cases what they're not doing that well.
Yeah. Why is it that zoning is not talked about or understood in the manner that you're describing it as being a very impactful and powerful aspect, actually an aspect of architecture when I think about it, but aspect of cities and people? Like, why is it in the back burner and not at the forefront of more conversations?
It beats me. I'm obviously fascinated by it. I guess probably it comes down to the fact that zoning codes are written in a way that's totally inaccessible. The zoning codes are 150 pages. They're filled with jargon. They are inconsistent internally, so there might be cross-references that don't make sense or definitions that contradict each other. And I think overall, they're not written so that people can understand them and engage with them. They're written like, any dense legal text is, for only experts to really access. And I do think that's why people feel disconnected or not even interested. Once you open your own town zoning code, you look at it as 230 pages with 50 chapters. It's like, forget it. So what I'm trying to do in the book is trying to say, okay, well, here are the key things, and here are maybe the words you might look for, or does your town have this kind of district, or does your town have this kind of thing, and trying to give people an entry point to try to engage with their own codes.
Do you think that many of the zoning codes were written in that confusing language because it's kind of, it was or is the default way of communicating these things, or that there was some perhaps intention as a way to make it more opaque?
I don't think anybody thought, let's make this as crazy as possible, except maybe the city of Boston, whose zoning code is about 3,800 pages long.
Whoa.
And I actually did do, last year, in January, I turned in a report that to the city evaluating their code, and I could not find a longer code. And Boston is only 40 square miles, and New York City doesn't even have as long as a code as Boston. So just to give you a sense of like how did that happen, and how it happened there was that every single neighborhood wanted their own custom built chapter of the zoning code. And so you had multiple appendices and specialized chapters, and a map with hundreds of zoning districts, which is again very unusual. And so that may be the worst of that. That does feel like at that point, at 3,800 pages, it does feel a little intentional. I chaired the City of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission for 7 years, and I had a lawyer tell me that I know, who will remain nameless, that after we rewrote the code to make it really, I hope, a lot more understandable to the average person, said, well, why did you do this? I was putting my child through college with the old code. And, he was exactly right. Only a lawyer that was well versed in the code could understand it. And that's not fair to ordinary property owners. And that's
Yeah.
why we rewrote the Hartford Code. That's also why I think people should take charge of their zoning destinies, for lack of a better
Zoning
phrase,
destinies, yeah, I like it.
and really try to engage with their own codes.
I guess one maybe basic question is who writes those codes and who decides on those rules? It's probably like what a lot of clients and architects would like to understand if they don't know. Yeah. Is how do those things get decided? How often do they get revised or updated?
Yeah, so in most states in the country, the zoning codes, which are all, by the way, written at the local level, but the zoning codes are adopted and amended by local elected officials. So a city council or a board of aldermen, those are the kinds of groups that typically have the final say over what the zoning code says. When you look at there's only one exception to that, and that is the state of Connecticut that I know of. And the state of Connecticut actually allows local governments to pass on to planning and zoning commissions the power to have the final say over the zoning code. So in Hartford's case, Hartford was one of those cities that delegated the power to zone to the Planning and Zoning Commission, which I chaired and very happily took on those powers. And so in our case, the Planning and Zoning Commission was the final authority. In other cases, it's the vast majority of cases, and about half of Connecticut, it's the local elected officials. So in a sense, the zoning process is by definition a political process for the most part.
Before I ask the question I was about to ask, I guess it would be helpful for listeners to understand in what ways zoning can be used and produce negative outcomes. I'm realize as I ask that question, there's a book worth of information as an answer, but just at a kind of high level, perhaps, like how can zoning be used in a negative manner?
Well, because zoning controls everything that can be built in a community, it can control land uses, it can control the way lots are developed, and it can control the height and size of structures. And in exercising all of those controls, you can see there might be good and bad consequences. So, for example, one of the things I talk about in Key to the City is the fact that many communities, the vast majority of communities on the vast majority of land, have minimum lot sizes that say, well, if you're building this kind of thing, you need to have an acre of land, or if you're building a restaurant, you need to have 1,000 square feet of open space, or if you're building an apartment building, you need 2 parking spaces for each unit. And so just in those 3 examples, minimum lot size, open space requirements, and minimum parking space requirements, you can see, okay, so that might be, well, maybe you think, well, this is great. Of course we need parking for housing. But what ends up happening is that you get a parking lot if you require parking. And that has maybe some negative consequences. Well, you might say, oh, well, providing an acre of land for a house, that's great. It's good for the environment. Well, actually, it's the opposite. You get sprawl because you have one house on 1 acre for acres and acres on end. And the only way to get that is to, when you're starting from scratch, is to uproot trees and destroy forest land, or to do the same thing for farmland. So you're not really getting the kind of, so again, things that people might say, oh, this makes sense, actually have some pretty negative consequences. And you do see many, many codes that have gone too far in all of those examples that I just mentioned.
I feel like it's a very complex thing. It's also, I think your examples highlight the difference between, the text on the page, so to speak, versus what happens in reality, and envisioning it actually being implemented and understanding the implications of that little piece of code and regulation, which is probably where architects come into play. I was wondering, as you were speaking about being the chair, and I was wondering, like, who do you think should be in charge of approving zoning regulations and changes? Because from my small perspective as an architect, when anything comes to regarding planning and zoning, I'm always thinking, but who is the I don't feel like the person who wrote this or is in charge of amending it and whatnot has any real understanding of what's happening in reality with this thing that has been written. And that's a frustration that I have, and I'm sure a lot of other folks in my position have as well.
Why haven't you joined the zoning board?
I have spoken at a few city council meetings here and there. It's a tough space to be in when you don't agree with the people on the board. I'll say that.
Yeah, I mean, but so think about it this way. The only way to make changes in your community is to raise your hand and be there in the trenches. And, the really interesting thing that's happening in communities around the country right now is you are sensing, you're starting to see a shift from what I would consider to be largely exclusionary zoning. So zoning that with the minimum lot sizes and single family requirements and all of that has really been designed to exclude people. You're seeing the yes in my backyard movement. You're seeing people for the first time show up to testify in favor of new housing or to testify in favor of other provisions that might make a code more environmentally sustainable or promote bike lane, bike infrastructure or something like that. And I do think there's a shift right now. And it really does start with the one person or the couple of people that are showing up at the meetings, raising their hands, writing the blog posts, encouraging their friends to show up, and then connecting to the statewide YIMBY movement or the national YIMBY movement and kind of keeping that momentum going. I am sensing that more and more. And so some people, you start alone, but you never know. I mean, why not run for city council? This is really like a David, job or volunteer job.
You're trying to get me to volunteer.
Counseling session. Yeah, this is really it's just an intervention. I don't even know where you live, but I'm encouraging you, because when you say you disagree with the status quo, then that by definition is a great qualification for somebody to be involved in zoning, because for too often zoning has maintained the status quo.
Yeah. Well, I guess I mean, I understand what you're saying, and it sort of course, makes sense. I guess the on the other side of the table, the folks who do hold the power, though, I mean, are there qualifications that have to be met? I mean, your background is convincing. If on paper and as you as a person, it's like, yeah, this is a person who should be in the position of authority, and we should take their expertise seriously. But oftentimes it doesn't quite feel that way. I don't know if there's an answer to this necessarily, but it seems to be the case. And maybe it's a result of the larger issue of zoning being, again, not as visibly talked about.
I think that's part of it. But also, if you think about who has time to show up to evening meetings or who feels entitled to make decisions, it's and people have studied this. It's usually male, white, wealthy homeowners. And each of those four words is doing something different. But you don't see renters, you don't see young mothers, you don't see people of color, you don't see transit riders. You see a sort of particular demographic. And that's not to say that, of course, there's not gross characterization of any one demographic, but you do see that when you ask who's making decisions, it's actually not necessarily representative of even that town, and much less the larger region or the larger context within which that town is situated.
Gotcha. That's actually a really good point and a good description of like who has the ability or the time to do this. And that plays into a lot of other factors. And now a quick break to thank the sponsors who support the second studio. We are supported by Enscape. Enscape is a real-time visualization and VR tool for the AEC industry. It is also a program that we use in our office. And we like it because, one, it's a plugin and not a separate application, which means we can work natively in our modeling programs such as Revit, SketchUp, Rhino, ArchiCAD, or Vectorworks. Two, it's super easy and versatile. We've used many other rendering programs, and a lot of times they're just difficult to use. That's not the case with Enscape. We can do renderings, 360-degree panoramas, videos, and immersive VR experiences with a breeze. Thirdly, it renders in real time, so we can see the light, shadows, and materials of the renderings as we're working. So start your free trial today by clicking the Enscape 3D link in our show notes.
One of the easiest ways to get accurate existing condition drawings for houses is with an iPhone or an iPad app called Canvas. Canvas is a tool we use on many of our projects. Instead of surveying a home manually, we simply scan it using our iPad, and Canvas processes the scan to produce accurate drawings and even 3D computer models. The file format works with AutoCAD, Revit, ArchiCAD, Vectorworks, SketchUp, and others. It is extremely easy to use, fast, and really has been a huge benefit for us and our clients. Try it out by visiting canvas.io/SSP and get your first as-built free.
I want to talk also about I'm going to get the name wrong, I know it, wrote it down, the National Zoning Atlas project.
Yes.
Can you tell us when that started and what that is?
So I started the National Zoning Atlas in 2020 when I created, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, a group called Desegregate Connecticut, which became a pretty strong nonprofit coalition that was tried to advance and did, in fact, successfully advance statewide zoning reforms, and is working at the local and state levels to try to continue to raise awareness about this structural racism that's embedded in our land use rules. But a common question in that movement, in that coalition building, became, well, how do you know that my town is a problem? Because you don't even know how we zone. Like, tell me how my town zones. And the truth is that we could not answer the question. So I developed a methodology where we could extract standardized information about each of Connecticut's 180 something zoning codes. I had a team that read over 32,000 pages of zoning codes across the state. And we integrated it into a map within 3 months, start to finish, and send it out to the public. And so the public could actually click on their own town and calculate how much single family zoning, how much multifamily zoning, how many, what's the minimum lot sizes, and so on in their town. So I do think that kind of project was illuminating for the zoning reform efforts, but it has also informed research on Connecticut. In particular, we just published something with the Urban Institute and about the correlations between zoning and demographic and racial and economic outcomes within individual Connecticut communities. But as information about that project got going, other people in other states said, okay, we want to build one too. So I wrote up the methodology, passed it around. People started making their own maps, published the code to make a map. And then more people started coming. Like, okay, Montana did it, New Hampshire did it, but they just kept coming. And so what ended up happening is I developed a framework, got funds to hire for initial team members of the National Zoning Atlas, built it out, and now I have about 25 people working for me full-time through a nonprofit, primarily through the nonprofit organization that houses the National Zoning Atlas, which I also started. So it's been a really fun project, and we have now chronicled land where over 115 million Americans live. It's online at zoningatlas.org. And we've done, let's see, if you're in New Hampshire or Rhode Island or Connecticut, Hawaii, Nevada, Arizona, you have your full state done. So you can go check that out. There might be a couple others. And we've made pretty significant progress in Colorado, Nevada, our external team in California. We've done most of the metro areas in Texas. And we're making some headway too in New York State. We just posted New York City. So I definitely invite your readers to check that out, because what you can do with it is just like what we were able to do with the Connecticut Atlas. You can see at scale how communities zone, and you can use the map to calculate what percentage of land in your chosen community, if it's on the map, actually zones for a particular outcome. So do check it out.
It's really cool. It's really, really cool. It's first of all a Herculean effort. When I read about it, I'm like, it's impressive and kind of crazy.
It is absolutely crazy. It's 100% crazy. Yeah.
And a team of 20,
Guaranteed.
which is a lot of people. But, you need a team like of 100 people. But you have made some serious progress, it sounds like. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I've said that we need 35. It's not outlandish. 35 geospatial analysts, 35 zoning code analysts for 2 years working full time to sweep through the country. And it's doable. It's just, it's really a matter of man effort. And you do need a human to read a zoning code. We have tried to use machine learning. We've tried to partner with some really smart people, and it's just impossible with the zoning code because of all the cross references, because of all the accreted information, because of the conflicts. We often have to find planners to help interpret their own code. In fact, two of the team members of the National Zoning Atlas just published an article in Zoning Practice, Jonah Palicia and Melissa Hayashida. And they published in Zoning Practice an article where they revealed this terrible truth, which is that a third of the codes that they had done as a zoning code and geospatial partnership had discrepancies between the map and the text. So you had we've always identified extinct districts, so districts that used to exist in the text but then got erased, but they're still on the map. We've also always logged unmapped districts, so things that are in the text but they aren't mapped. But what we hadn't logged, and they started doing this, was like serious discrepancies. You have districts that are named, let's say, commercial 1, commercial 2, commercial 3 in the text, and the only thing you see in the map is the commercial district. So then, like, what's 1, 2, and 3? Like, what rules apply? And that's a serious problem. I mean, you're laughing, but like, think if you're a small business person, so-and-so, and you go to the map and you say, oh, C district, and you go to the code. There's no correlation. And that's actually like kind of a legal issue. They did not call out specific towns, but they did look at communities in 6 different states and found, again, that a third had discrepancies. So what does that tell you about the state of zoning in this country? People think that, zoning, we can't touch it, it's sacred. But it's actually like not really that sacred. And also it can be wrong. So that's bad.
People think it should be a working document too. I mean, it shouldn't be like it's like set in stone. It should be meant to evolve and get revised. So did those kind of like discrepancies between the documents that you found, eventually you were able to get them corrected, or?
Oh, no. No, that's not at all what happened. Marina, come on.
I don't know. I mean, I'm like, you're putting the work in. You found problems.
You're the optimist.
No, what ended up happening was our analysts would call the jurisdiction and ask the planner, hey, I found this. They'd do the best they could in trying to figure out how to resolve the discrepancies. So the planner would say, oh, well, C1 is on Main Street and C2 is on the other streets. Well, where's C3? Actually, we never use C3, so you can call it unmapped. Okay. So then we kind of translated that and put it into the map. But no, they don't change. And they don't, I mean, a lot of them are smaller towns, places where maybe the planning official only works part-time or is responsible for multiple towns. And again, somebody wrote that zoning code or did that map, and they just like forgot to do the other. I don't think any of that kind of thing is malicious, but it does raise legal issues. And when we identify them, they don't get fixed. They just move away. We just move along, and it's not great.
Yeah. I've also been wondering with zoning, is it just destined to become more and more complex? You mentioned Boston being however many pages, which is excessive and on the extreme end of the spectrum, but still it feels like, there's just more and more text constantly being added, which in a way is necessary to make changes to improve things. But also I wonder if we're just compounding the problem of complexity, if that makes sense.
So I had I'm just checking this document that I sent over to them. It's called Reforming the Boston Code. It's on SSRN if anybody wants to download it. And I did delete the phrase because they kind of asked me to. They were like, "Oh, is this really necessary?" But I called it a barnacle encrusted ship because that's kind of how like the zoning code is moving through the ocean, and then like there's just like stuff that gets placed on it, and then kind of goes along, and then it almost sinks. I mean, that's kind of how I viewed the Boston zoning code. Is it just was one of those things it just added to it to the point where it made it impossible to really understand. So I do think, yes, the status quo or the inertia. My daughter's learning about the concept of inertia in her 6th grade science class. The inertia for a zoning code is just to get bigger and more complex. But part of what we did in Hartford was to throw out a much more complex code, a code that had, I think, a 51-page use table. It was changed to a 3-page use table. So a use table, for people who have never seen the zoning code, is often a complicated series of individual uses and a sort of a chart showing the districts where those uses can be built. So it might say movie theaters or housing units. In the case of Hartford, the 51-page or so, I think it was 51, it was very long, use table had vermicelli factories in some zones and rice factories in other zones. And it's like, well, where in Hartford do we right now, in this very day, have a vermicelli factory? And like, maybe we did at some point, but, and also why was that allowed in different zones than rice factory? No one knows.
Okay.
But that's maybe an example of why we did not really need that level of specificity, and we did not need a 51-page use table.
It's interesting, the National Zoning Atlas, on the one hand, we talked about it being a very challenging task. On the other hand, too, it's kind of like, why wasn't this already done like decades and decades and decades ago? It kind of makes sense that something like this would exist for people to have access to. And I guess if it wasn't for you and your team, we probably wouldn't have it, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. You would not have it. We've seen over the last 4 years, people have showed up to our doorstep saying, "Oh, we have the thing for you. We've done this great shortcut. We've done this machine learning thing. We've taken assessors' records and translated zoning." But there is no shortcut. There is no shortcut to the kind of data we are collecting, which is really looking at the zoning code and looking at the zoning text. I wish somebody had done it before, because what we can do now, which we'll do, for example, in Massachusetts, where there was a recent big statewide zoning change, is if we had logged historical zoning data at some point, we could actually use current zoning data to see how zoning affected changes over time. So we could show causation. Right now, we can only show correlation because we've only collected zoning at one point in time. I raise the issue of Massachusetts because Massachusetts is one of those states where you saw statewide zoning reform that compelled towns to change their zoning around transit stations. So right now, we've collected all of Massachusetts pre-state law, the MBTA Communities Bill, and now we're going to go back and log the changes as they come in after the state law has been in effect, and the cities and towns have to redo their zoning code. So that is one example of a kind of change that is going to make a huge difference. And what we want to know after maybe 10 years of this law being in effect is how many housing units were created, how much new development was created.
Yeah.
We will be able to know that now because of the zoning atlas, because in 10 years, we'll be able to look back and see, the date that something was changed and actually pretty significantly so.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting to think that, we would write zoning regulation and establish those rules and, probably establishing those rules thinking that they will have some sort of impact in the better sense of it, right, down the line. But if nobody ever looks at where we started, where we are, and where we're headed, then what is the point, right, to writing those rules? Because there is no metrics, there is no analysis.
Yeah.
There is no metrics, there is no. And, analysis.
Exactly.
There is no analysis. There is no metrics. 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 There is no analy
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of work done on zoning, studies on zoning, and as it relates to housing. But in the book, I try to describe areas that go beyond housing. So environmental controls, water management, transportation and transit issues, small business development, industrial area, conversions, and all of those areas are woefully understudied. We haven't
Mm-hmm.
really studied the impacts, not only the impacts on land uses, but on public health.
Mm-hmm.
What is the impact of changing an area from single family large lot residential to a mix of uses?
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't
Um,
know.
do you find in your circles that there are other people who are, I don't know, as qualified and interested and engaged in these conversations and trying to proactively do something with it? Because, and I asked that question, I guess for me, so my master's is in urban design, and there's a lot of planning courses and urban history courses and whatnot. And so we had touched on some of the things that we're talking about here and other things as well, and really city infrastructure. And at some point during that degree, which I adored and I loved, I just felt like, okay, this is great, but is anyone doing anything? Kind of to your point earlier, is anyone doing anything about this information that we have? Do you find on your side and in your circles again that there is a movement building up, kind of at your tier, I suppose, as opposed to lonely David going out on a Wednesday night and talking to the city council?
Oh, the lonely Davids of the world are the change makers, believe it or not. I mean,
I'm
of
gonna
course, I
put that
hear
on my screensaver.
the lonely Davids are the change makers. Yes, it's like
Yeah,
the meek shall inherit the earth or something.
right.
Um, uh, I mean, for me, I mean, I hear from a lot of people who are into zoning. I'm like a zoning geek magnet or something
Right,
in
right.
that sense. Because, like, that maybe it's there's people out there who are working in their own communities who are fascinated by it, but just don't have anybody else to talk to. They find me, and I'm happy to talk to them. But I do feel like there are lots of people out there who have some of the pieces, but not all of the pieces. I mean, there's some people, land use attorneys and city planners, and the elites of the YIMBY movement and so on. And I don't mean elites like not in that way. I mean like the leaders of the
Right.
YIMBY movements and the local chapters and things. Like, they've got their talking points. They know exactly what they're doing. Um, but many people kind of have a part of it, or they have some information, and they just kind of need the bigger picture. And that's kind of what I hope my book will provide, is those people who, they know that there's something going on with zoning. Maybe they attended a meeting, maybe they heard something from their neighbor, they got a flyer to sign a petition, and they're like, what is this about? And they're curious. I think that it's those people that are maybe, they know that there's something, but they just need like more information to kind of put it all together. And those are the
Mm-hmm.
people that I think can be converted to
Mm-hmm.
be those people that are much more engaged in zoning conversations. That's my hope anyway. And I am very hopeful because I do see people who are interested in zoning for lots of different reasons. And they come at it from a social justice perspective or from an
Mm-hmm.
environmental perspective, pro housing perspective. And again, I enjoy talking with people and understanding why they got involved. Some people get involved because they're like, saw some crazy thing happen in their neighborhood, and then they're like,
Mm-hmm.
"What is going on here?" And then they get involved too.
Yeah, I love it. That's great. You were talking about folks maybe missing pieces of the puzzle or something to that effect. And it reminded me, I was wondering, how has your architecture education impacted your perspective on all of this? And I'm also asking that kind of from the angle that I shouldn't propose my biases, but I feel like having an architecture degree like you have imparts some kind of knowledge and understanding, which is different from somebody who, let's say, strictly goes the city planning route and doesn't have that architecture background. I don't mean to pick on city planners. I'm not trying to do that, but I'm just wondering if there's something you feel that education brought to their table, for you.
Yeah, I mean, I actually talk about this a little in the book, and I am going to open it because I can tell
Nice.
you, in the last chapter. So, anybody who goes to architecture school knows about Vitruvius, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
the Roman architects. So I do have a little paragraph about that. I'm happy to read it if you want me to, but I can
Yeah.
also sort of summarize. Yes, okay. All right. So and I really do. I care about the quality of space. That's what architecture education brings you. So I definitely care about the quality of space, and I do think zoning has a huge role to play in that. But this is maybe the paragraph that is most relevant to that. So it says, it's again at the very end, we would do well to follow the thinking of famed Roman architect Vitruvius, who wrote that every great building must have three features: utilitas, venustas, and firmitas, usually translated to mean utility, delight, and firmness, or commodity, right? A building that isn't useful or doesn't function well for its occupants is a waste. Its configuration of walls, entrances, and windows must ensure that people can use it for its intended purpose. A building that is not beautifully expressed will never delight us, even if it manages to stand up and serve a purpose. And a building without structural integrity, without a strong foundation, and with faulty or insecure components will collapse. Like a great building, our places too need to be useful, beautiful, and well structured. In function, they must thrive with activities that meet the needs of a mix of residents, workers, and visitors alike. In experience, they must be visually appealing, elicit a sense of order and calm, and be scaled to the human body. And in overall structure, they must deploy thoughtfully designed public systems, from transportation to open space, for the benefit of all who use them. So I do think right there, the last
Mm-hmm.
pages of the book,
Yeah.
it really kind of, I actually wanted to organize the whole book around the Vitruvian triad. And my publisher said,
Oh.
nobody's going to understand that. And I said, no, but I did kind of anyway, but I didn't do it at the beginning. They wouldn't let me do it at the beginning. This is too, nobody's going to get that. But you get it. So I
Yeah,
will
yeah,
take
yeah.
that. But I do think that's, I mean, it's about, the city has to be well structured. It has to have a use, has to be purposeful, and it has to be delightful. And that delight part is something that I think we forget in zoning. And I think that there are some ways that we can enliven our cities. And yeah, I mentioned a few examples in the book on that too.
I love that. And I was really wondering, of those three qualities, is the more qualitative one, the delight and the beauty, is that the one that's the most under thought about, or harder to have people understand the value of
or
it,
harder to implement even,
and make it actionable? Because it's a bit more elusive than the others, right?
Yeah.
Like utility, people can understand if it works, if it doesn't work, but creating a delightful place or space or city is again, a bit more nuanced.
There is no substitution for architectural and aesthetic education, and we should have that in our schools so that everybody can benefit from a more educated populace on that front, just like we educate for science, just like we educate for math. I do think that art, beauty, architecture, design, these are all fundamental things that we should know about and have some training or understanding of, and we don't. So you're right that it does depend on maybe the few to try to elevate the public realm, or to try to be sure, okay, we're hiring the right architects, or we're writing the right rules to get a result that's pleasing and, as I said, calming, even orderly, but also surprising in a nice way. And you cannot. It is not, too few people can do that well. So I wish there was more architectural education, aesthetic education, design, even planning education at the middle school and high school levels, for sure. Trust me, my poor children get that. I've got 3 of them. I apologize to them in the book as well. Sorry.
Today we're learning about Vitruvius.
Yeah, no, they really have all of that, and they are. I think they're going to be well served by it later.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I'm sure. It's a really good point. I love that answer. I was writing down as you were speaking that we take these interviews and we do little short reels on Instagram. I'm like, at this mark, the 50-minute, we will make that into a clip right there. It's a really good point though, because I think it being part of the education is, I mean, I'm biased perhaps, but I think it's critical, and it's much, I don't know. It's an essential component of cities and of life anyway to understand these things. And yeah, it's strange that oftentimes it's the sciences that get more easily preserved rather than, let's say, the arts, if we're being kind of rudimentary about it.
I mean, I think you need all, and that's why I mentioned at the top of the interview, architecture school has physics, it has construction, it has, but it also has hand drawing. At least it used to when I was there. Maybe they just do computers, but they should still have hand drawing. That is a must. And if we did have that, then this book could have been a lot shorter. It could have been,
Right.
if we did have that baseline across the country, I think I would have written the book in a different way, but we don't.
Interesting.
You did mention earlier in our conversation that there is a few places around the country that are doing some interesting things with zoning. And I want to make sure that we're, kind of like being optimistic in our conversation and talking a little bit about those. Do you have some examples about where maybe those places are and what they are doing a little bit differently with zoning?
So I talk a lot about Hartford in the book because I helped to rewrite that code. So that one's an easy one. We legalized all housing units, different districts, I should say. But where we legalize housing, it's legalized as of right. There are no public hearings for housing. We eliminated minimum parking requirements, which are costly and land wasting. We included provisions on street design that were implemented in one of the few large-scale developments the city has seen within city limits in recent years, and I think the streets there look pretty good. We required, instead of minimum parking, bike infrastructure, bike parking, and bike showers and changing facilities and things like that. And I mean, in general, we expanded the mix of uses that could be built in the city. One of the things, and I'm drinking an athletic beer right now, but if I were in Hartford, it's non-alcoholic, I would be drinking a Colt Brewery beer from Hooker Brewery. And so I tell the story in the book about a brewery that would not have been allowed to be located in this very amazing building that used to be the Colt Manufacturing Complex, which is historic arms manufacturing complex in Hartford, one of the first large businesses run by a lady, Elizabeth Colt. But anyway, today the building was vacant for many years, and over the last maybe 15, 20 years, it has been slowly redeveloped and perfect place for a brewery. But the zoning code that we had just written didn't allow it. And it wasn't because we had anything against breweries, it was really an oversight. And once he brought it to our attention, the Hooker Brewery, Kurt, the founder of Hooker Brewery, brought it to our attention. We sort of went through this process of rezoning. And for me, that is emblematic of the way that we did zoning in Hartford, because we wrote this great code. We adopted it in early 2016. And actually, during the last 3 years in the commission, we amended that code at least a dozen times. And we amended it to correct issues like the one that Hooker Brewery brought up, but also as we even learned about even more best practices in zoning, we adopted those too. So I guess I would just say, in Hartford, it's not just the substance, but also the approach, trying to make sure that we were continually refining the code to meet the needs of the community. In that case, yeah, let's get a brewery. And again, that would be what I might be drinking if I were in Hartford. And there's some other cities too in the book. I mean, I talk about Delray, Florida, which is, I think, was named at one point the most fun town in America. And I had no idea about the zoning there, but I walked up and down the main drag, Atlantic Avenue, which is perpendicular to the ocean, I think. And we were on the beach and went to go get lunch and just noticed all around, hey, these things look pretty similar. There's fun colors, there's awnings, there's nice little sidewalks. And sure enough, I later read the zoning code, and there it was. It's all in the zoning code. That kind of development was something that zoning anticipated and reinforced. So again, there's a lot of examples in the book, but those are maybe a couple of highlights.
I love it. The another topic that I want to talk about, I know we're coming on the hour here, is affordable housing. And in what ways can zoning help us create more affordable housing? And another question that's maybe sort of related to that. We used to live in New York City for some time, and we saw the place become gentrified, even over the relatively short period of time we were there. Is gentrification like just an inevitable thing, or can zoning help us, I don't know, control, direct it, or do something so we have affordable housing in a neighborhood that's also affordable, by the way?
I mean, the best way to keep housing affordable is to create more of it. So I am I mean, the research shows that across the board. Anybody that says otherwise is not factually correct. So you look at, the places where in New York City, there have been huge creations of housing. And without that new development, let's say the Gowanus Canal and other places like that, you would have more pressures in other neighborhoods, and rents would have risen, or prices would have risen faster than if you did not have those homes to relieve some of the pressure. So in general, a zoning code that allows more housing will be a zoning code that allows a more affordable city. New York City does artificially constrain housing in a lot of different ways, something that we found through our analysis of the New York City zoning atlas results, but we'll have more published on that soon enough. I will say, on the question of gentrification, for many cities, especially post-industrial cities like Hartford and Buffalo and Detroit, and cities where you've lost population, there's not as much of an issue with displacement of existing residences as there is. I think that some of that there's because there many places, many buildings that were once housing and were once occupied are not. So just again, by definition, if gentrification is really about displacement, you don't see a lot of that necessarily in post-industrial cities. Of course, there's always in those cities the need to create even more affordable housing. But in Hartford, 40% of the units are deed restricted to be affordable. And even then, we still need to create more market rate housing to actually generate the tax base and to use many vacant lots throughout the city, but lots that were cleared to meet minimum parking requirements and zoning oftentimes. So you see, I think, the need for more housing. I do talk in the book a bit about Pittsburgh's experiment with an inclusionary zoning ordinance, which requires all new developments to have a certain percentage of affordable housing. Those sometimes work, but usually they do not.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
The final question that I have, well, we usually ask folks what their favorite building is, which you can answer that question as well too. So we'll ask that question, but maybe a more pertinent question would be, what is your favorite
zoning code?
Piece of zoning regulation? No, maybe like, what's your favorite place? An outdoor space, a neighborhood, a town, something bigger than just a building is what I'm trying to get at.
Well, one of my favorite buildings, I might have mentioned, is the Mill Museum in Houston. I love that building. But if you don't know my favorite place, that means you haven't gotten to the last chapter of the book. My favorite place is where I am right now. My favorite place of the moment, at least the way I characterize it in the book, is Georgetown, a neighborhood in Washington, D.C., where I live, which is beautiful and walkable and has street trees and parks and a mix of uses, and actually has great zoning, as I sort of conclude the book on that optimistic note. And I'm very glad to conclude our conversation with a bit of optimism, in that, in this very historic place, a place with lots of beautiful architecture, but new buildings too. You see that kind of mix that people pay a lot of money for, because we're not building like this anymore outside of places like Washington, D.C. And I can tell you right now that people like to live this way. And so zoning needs to enable more townhouses, more walkability, narrower streets, more street trees, more bikes, get bikes all over this neighborhood, and really and fewer curb cuts. There's hardly any curb cuts in this neighborhood either. And I think zoning can play a role in allowing for more people to live this way. So it, again, alleviates the price pressure to be in a community like this. So that's my closing thought, and I'm really glad that you asked that question.
Well, thank you so much for making the time you're on the East Coast, so it's Monday evening, in fact. Serious dedication for the cause here. This was really enjoyable and super fascinating, and thanks for making the time again.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for having me. You guys are great hosts, and look forward to seeing your podcast.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's episode. If you like what we are doing, then please support the show by leaving it a review in the Apple Podcast app. You can also find us on Spotify and YouTube. You can find us on Instagram, which is Second Studio Pod is our handle. Our website is also Second Studio Pod, and we have a hotline, which is 213-222-6950. Text it, call, leave a voicemail for guest suggestions, comments, questions, topics, and that about covers it, right?
Yep.
Awesome. Talk soon. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.